Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adam Golov, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers, so please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we'll make them available on our website. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide, please. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide, please. We serve a very broad client base. Next slide, please. Spanning across all industries. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Joe Pearman, Lead Consultant, Meccan Limited. Joe helps clients realize the full potential of structured content and taxonomy. Before joining Meccan, he led the implementation of a DITA XML-based component content management system at HTC, driving development of the information model, solving numerous publishing and localization challenges, and designing the support content architecture for HTC's help app and responsive website. Without further ado, welcome Joe.
Thank you very much, Adam. So I don't need to spend a great deal of time on this slide. Thanks for the intro. Just to say, yeah, at Mecon, I'm the consulting practice lead, and what we do is help organizations solve their complex content problems, and it could be that they're doing product content and the products are very complex and have a lot of variants and so on, and the content needs to keep up with that, and so that's something that we help people plan for and manage with structured content. Or it could equally be expanding the audience for a company's content, whether or not that content is actually the product that the organization provides. So lots of work around information architecture, requirements gathering, prototyping systems to make sure they're what people expect them to be and that they work okay, and taxonomy, increasing amount of taxonomy in recent years. And as you already mentioned, I came from HCC where I did quite a lot with DITA, did a mobile content delivery platform also based on that, and did lots of interesting things with localization and web delivery and so on. But this talks about project failures, and I think it's a really interesting theme because when you go to conferences or read blogs and so on, not an awful lot of people talk about what happens when content management projects go wrong. You often hear the success stories, and of course particularly software vendors are interested in emphasizing the big successes, but I think we all need to hear a bit more about the failures to understand how often they happen and why they happen and what we can do about that, and so that's what this talk is about. And so here's a typical kind of a disaster. So a big manufacturing company was facing increasing support needs, and users were basically complaining about the products on social media or asking about their issues with the products on social media. And so the company thought, instead of directing them to some kind of dedicated support forum or something, which may have limited success, why not reach out to people directly on social media and respond to their needs there, start the conversation there and respond to exactly what they need, which was a great idea. And a leading kind of CRM vendor was engaged to help with this. So the project made a good start. Some way along, it was realized that content was going to be a really important thing for these support staff. So it's not only sending people the right bits of content that they might need to solve their issues, but for the support staff to reference internal knowledge bases and so on. And it was thought at that time that the existing the internal systems for managing content were not adequate for this, and so a new CMS vendor was engaged to help out. The trouble was, at that point, there was no consultation with the people actually producing the content, so that was a bit tough. Obviously, a big mistake. A little while later, a few months later, after the project was already kind of planned out and scoped out, then the content stakeholders were brought on board. It's a little bit late by then for them to have much influence on on the course of the project, but nevertheless they did their best, and some small tweaks were made to the project plan, and so it went along. But as things went along, it became clear that there was no way that people could make this change to a new way of working in the time scale that was set out, using the tools that had been arranged for them. They just weren't adequate. There were a lot of requirements from the previous tools that hadn't been properly addressed in the new ones. So big problems around there. And upper management seemed to start to lose faith at that point, and there were budget cutbacks. And then, in fact, there was a loss of communication from the core project team to other people around the business. They basically stopped talking altogether, didn't respond to phone calls or emails or anything like that. So after a couple of months of this silence, the project leader said that she was going to be leaving, but it would all be okay because she was handing over to her deputy, who would pick things up and carry on and make the project a success. So there was a plan for a handover. It didn't really happen that way, unfortunately. It was a very partial handover at best. Lots of kind of documentation was lost, and vital information was just disregarded. So there's no handover, and then eventually the deputy himself also left, and there was a meeting held between the remaining stakeholders to see if the project could be rescued at all, and the decision was basically not. It was a complete disaster. So over $1 million were wasted, tens of thousands of people hours spent on this thing. It sounds pretty drastic. It seems like an extreme case. Surely this doesn't happen very much. Well, I'm afraid it does. So here's two quotes from industry leaders here, pretty typical kind of viewpoints. So somebody's saying 50% or more of CMS projects fail in some way, botched implementations and so on. So these are subjective quotes. What about statistics? And while these are general, they're not specific to content management. Nevertheless, I think they're pretty typical of content management projects on the whole. As you see, lots of projects failing to fully meet their objectives, missing time, budget, or quality goals, suffering failures. So a pretty bleak picture here. I think the interesting thing is these latter two surveys, where some people knew that the project would fail right from the start. So if they knew this, how did they know it? And are there any early warning signs that others in the project, perhaps the leads of the project, could pay attention to and perhaps do something about before it's too late? And of course, the recording of this webinar will be available later if you want to go back through these statistics. But yeah, are there any early warning signs? They're the equivalent of the canary in the coal mine that can basically tell us when things are going wrong. Well, there was some interesting work by a researcher called Leon Kappelman and his colleagues on early warning signs of potential IT project failure, so specifically on what we're looking at. And they define these early warning signs as obvious within the first 20% of the project timeline. So a number of IT project managers, they listed out all the early warning signs they could think of. Those were kind of aggregated, and they were ranked by importance. And then they found there were 12 really important ones, and those could be divided into two groups, people-related ones and process-related early warnings. So let's have a look at what these actually are. So here are the people-related ones. So top one, lack of top management support, and I think that should be no surprise. But all of these, I think, have a specific flavor when it comes to content management, and I think it's worth looking at them in that light. So what are some of the things about lack of top management support, some of the characteristics around content management? And I think that people often feel it's just content. They don't really appreciate it enough. That is changing. I mean, the content strategy movement has made good inroads, but I think there is still this element of underestimating content and its impacts on customers, and the benefits that you can have from working with content in a more systematic, efficient and powerful way, and improving the user experience around that. So lack of top management support, very important one. Weak project manager stands for itself really. Lack of stakeholder involvement or participation. So this is a really crucial one. And I think when it comes to content technology, because it's a bit of a niche, we really need to spend time explaining to people around the organization what we're proposing to do, how it's going to work, and how the benefits are going to be achieved. This is really crucial to the eventual success of the project. People have to understand how it works in some way that's deeper than simply being persuaded by ROI numbers and that kind of thing. And I can think of one particular case here. So stakeholders are not only those who have the kind of deciding votes in whether a project goes ahead or not, but they're also those who need to contribute to the success of the project. And one particular case I can think of, a medical device company, was involved in a big move to structured content. And as part of that, they had quite an ambitious pilot. And I read a very good article on the DCL blog the other day about how you shouldn't make your pilot projects too big, and I totally agree. And this particular project had been much too big and taking in much too much content, and the content that it included needed a lot of rework, basically. So it was not only about testing the technical aspects of this move, but also very much about getting people to restructure and rewrite the content from scratch. So big, big job. And the trouble was that one person became a bottleneck for all of this. And so this was a subject matter expert, an engineer, who basically needed to review all this new content and give it the all clear before it could actually go through and be published. And so he was holding up the whole pilot. He didn't want to, of course, but he just had too much stuff to do, and he just couldn't cope with all this work. And it ended up holding up the pilot by 6 months, I think, which had a massive impact, financial impact, of course. Luckily, the projects did carry on with a much more sensibly sized pilot, and it was an eventual success, but still quite a knock to the project there in the early stages. So stakeholder involvement and education is critical. Weak commitment of the project team, again, really important factor there. The project team themselves have to be totally committed, and that's sometimes difficult because you have to do your day jobs as well. And particularly if people planning the project haven't allowed for that, and they're just thinking that people can somehow fit this work in their spare time, all the planning that goes with a move to a different way of working with content, then they'll have to think again really at some point. Team members lacking the requisite knowledge or skills, and I think this comes back to the education type of thing. There's a lot to learn about with new content technologies, and so you need specific training on that, and ongoing kind of mentoring and training, and you need more than one expert on that within the organization. If you're just relying on one person, that's too dangerous. Subject matter experts being overscheduled. Now here, this doesn't mean what we'd normally say in the content world about subject matter experts like engineers reviewing content. This is more about people, say, from IT who have a say in the implementation of a new content management system. So of course, if they're overscheduled, then they can't contribute to those decisions. So those are all the people-related early warnings. And then we go on to the process-related ones. And to be honest, I see these as also very much people ones, because if we look down through here, we've got requirements. There's always a human factor to requirements. We've got change control, very much a human factor there, stakeholders, resources, and so on and so on. So I think this is equally about people. Lack of documented requirements. How does this manifest in content management? I think often it's people pick a shiny tool or are persuaded by a shiny tool, and then if they do any requirements, they're kind of all retroactively shaped around the capabilities of the tool itself. So that's no good, of course, but I've seen it happen a number of times. Or perhaps there are requirements, but they're just kind of a birthday wish list, rather than based on a sensible grounding on what this technology is capable of doing. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. Lack of a change control process here. And I think this is particularly because a lot of the projects that Kappelman and his colleagues looked at, I mean, this was a while ago, and they're all what we would now call kind of waterfall-based projects, or most of them were. And so when we talk about lack of change control process, I think it really means lack of flexibility, lack of the ability to adapt as the business requirements change. And that's really important. You've got to be able to learn as you go along. Okay, and ineffective schedule planning or management, not understanding that content is complex, really. People often underestimate the problems around content. And also this thing called the planning fallacy, which I'll go into later. Communication breakdowns, of course, resources assigned to higher priority projects, pretty obvious. And then no business case for the project, and this seems to happen quite a lot with structured content, in that people just think, well, I need data, I need XML, we need structure, it's going to do this magical kind of stuff for us. Somehow just by converting all our stuff into data, it's going to become this magical database of content, and I can build any book I can imagine on the fly. And of course, as anybody knows who's used this stuff for any while, it doesn't really work like that. You've got to put a significant investment into planning and training and figuring out how it's going to work with the tool. So that's the list of those early warnings. I think they're quite useful. But we have to look at them critically as well. So we looked at the canary in the coal mine, and that was a very effective early warning. Not very good for the canary, of course, but good for the miners. Here's an interesting one now. Farmers say that if a cow sits down, if all the cows in the field are sitting down, then it's a sign that rain is going to come. So an interesting one, and one we should approach critically. Can we trust this early warning sign? I'll tell you the answer to that later, by the way. So I think these early warning signs are definitely helpful. I mean, they're a kind of convenient checklist to go through and see whether your project is facing these kinds of problems. And they are fairly easy to understand, and they even suggest their own fixes to some extent, in obvious ways, to say, well, if you don't have enough stakeholder involvement, then involve stakeholders. If you don't have a change control process, then agree on one, and so on. Perhaps a little bit too obvious in some ways, but anyway, they can be helpful. And if you're watching out for this kind of stuff, you can catch certain project risks before they get dangerous. And here's a case. So software companies' user guides covered a vast range of products and variants and languages. And this was all done using Adobe InDesign. Great tool, but absolutely the wrong tool for the job. And so something like a DITA solution was obviously a very good fit for this. And a pilot was run successfully using DITA XML, small-scale pilot. And then the organization was looking at getting a powerful component CMS to really properly manage this DITA and all these variants of the product content. And so all this was done according to industry best practices and set up in that way. And once it had been running for a month or two, two of the writers who had some previous DITA experience in a much smaller company with arguably a much less complicated product structure complained that the configured system was too complex, and other writers followed suit after that. And it's a tricky one because, of course, it's a complex product structure. You can't totally hide that. That complexity has got to go somewhere. But anyway, here we see weak commitment of project team. I mean, that sounds a bit pejorative, but it's certainly a lack of confidence among the project team, I would say. And this was partly because of the external time pressures to get on with other real work as well. But I think very much that the project team lacked requisite knowledge or skills to really deal with this stuff or understand it in context about how it was set up. So it's very important to undertake some proper education and engagement there, some more engagement. So whole team meetings were held and honest feedback was gathered. And then a couple of the team, including the writers who had been concerned about the complexity, were tasked with going and trying alternate version control approaches. And they were prototyped and demonstrated with the team. And pretty close to the original one, but a variant of that was chosen by consensus. Not a vote, but consensus, and I think that worked really well. Everybody was much happier after that point, having felt more engagement and involvement with the final architecture. And then one of those writers with more DITA experience contributed a lot more to IA decisions subsequently. So rebellion peacefully averted there. So quite a successful example of picking up some emergent kind of risks to the project that could have got nasty if they'd gone on but dealing with it appropriately at an early stage. So the early warnings can be quite helpful in that kind of case, but they have some not quite so helpful aspects. I mean, they all came from those indicators, the 12 indicators, they came from hindsight, and everything looks clear in hindsight, of course. But when we think about that big kind of disaster that I showed, really at what point did it become clear that it was going to be a complete failure? And I would say, looking from the outside, not for quite a while, to be honest. I think there was a lot of optimism and kind of groupthink in a way to really try to make it work even against all the odds and all the evidence. And so the early warnings don't tell you how bad things should get before you need to take action. And people might not want to even heed these early warnings. They don't want to rock the boat. They might think, well, we've already spent so much on this thing, we can't stop now, otherwise we'll lose this money. This is a cognitive bias, actually. It's our brain tricking ourselves. It's called the sunk costs fallacy, if you want to talk about that. Or just, in fact, a few people protecting their own position, because who wants to be associated with a failure, as it were? And I think a lot of companies, a lot of organizations have a bit of a blame culture that doesn't make it easy to admit where there might be risks and weaknesses. But overall, it's not enough just to say, well, look at these early warnings. There's a problem. We've got to go a bit deeper than that. We've got to have criteria for identifying when there's really a problem, and then steps for doing something about it. So here are some tentative kind of criteria. I mean, it's always going to be a case of judgment, and I think maybe more caution is better than less in a way. And if you are concerned about something in a project that you're working on, then perhaps raise that. And that's something I've always done in my career, raise concerns early. And in fact, people have appreciated me doing that in the end. Sometimes not at the time, but in the end they've appreciated it. So are several of those early warnings apparent, and particularly if it's that one about dwindling upper management support? That's a good case for investigating and seeing if you really need to turn things around. Is there serious concern over the assumed technical architecture? Are people going ahead with something that they don't really understand how it works and how it's going to achieve the benefits? If so, then I think that's a good case for stopping and having a good hard look at how things are going. Or perhaps the project's already in production, as it were, and people are avoiding the system, they're trying not to use it, or if they are using it, they're having to adopt these kind of horrible workarounds just to get content out in the way that they used to do so. And so if that's happening, then of course you've got trouble on your hands. There's no popular support for the system, and so sooner or later it's going to be out the door. So those are some of the criteria. So what's a sensible approach to turning these things around? And this is going to sound a little bit like Alcoholics Anonymous, but it's always about acknowledging there's a problem. I mean, it's really important. You can't pretend to yourself that everything's fine. You've always got to be honest with yourselves as a team. And in the literature on project failures, there was a particularly bad example. I think it was written by somebody from the kind of PMP, Project Management School, who suggested that if a project was facing severe difficulties, then maybe what would help it was for the project team to go out to the pub and go for a happy hour or something. And all I can think of is that if the project is that bad, then going to the pub could just be a recipe for violence, really. So I really wasn't impressed. I think you've got to tackle these things at the root and take them seriously, and it's not just a question of having a drink and everything's going to be fine. So honesty is always better. And I think there's also a tendency to be very kind of binary about things, to say it's either a success or it's a failure. And most often things are somewhere in the middle. No project is 100% successful on all its goals. When we think of some of the big architectural achievements, some of them were way over schedule and budget. And so we've got Sydney Opera House over 1,000% over budget, and many other famous cases there. And so, of course, these, we wouldn't say they're failures. They're amazing kind of constructions. They just cost a bit more than people originally thought they were going to. And here's a bit of context for some of those statistics I had earlier, to say that, you know, this focus on did they all meet exactly their budget, schedule, and scope goals. Well, not all of them did, and sometimes in some cases it didn't actually matter that much because the scope changed during the project, and then the project had to change to meet the changing business requirements. So you have to take this kind of stuff with a pinch of salt, I think. So once you've acknowledged that there's some kind of a problem and you have to improve things in some way, then what can you do? I think you have to take a long, hard look at things. And first of all, look at, are the original objectives even attainable? And so quite often people are overly optimistic about timescales and about what they're going to be able to achieve. And I have to say some vendors are not that helpful because they encourage them in this thinking. And so are these original objectives even attainable? Here's where that planning fallacy thing I talked about earlier comes in. And so the psychologist Daniel Kahneman, he wrote that great book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And in that book, he talked about when he was involved in a curriculum development project for high schools in Israel. And the project team had estimated, based on having done a little bit of the work on the curriculum, they'd done a couple of chapters, I think, and this, from the speed with which they finished those first 2 chapters, they thought the whole thing would take basically 2 or 3 years to finish up. And then Daniel Kahneman thought to ask the one of the team who had the most experience, well, has anybody else managed to do a similar curriculum in that time? And the guy had a long kind of think about it and then came back and said, well, actually, quite a lot of people never managed to finish their syllabus. And of the ones that did, nobody did it in under 8 years. So massively more than they've been thinking about. And Kahneman goes on to kind of poke fun at himself and say that he made the biggest mistake because he allowed the team to go on and continue developing the syllabus, knowing that it was going to take much longer than they'd originally thought. And in fact, it took 10 years in the end and never actually was used in real life. So pretty much for a failure there. But from this, he called this the planning fallacy, and he developed a way to work around it and has popularized this idea of taking an outside view, which is really to do what that team did and to look at, for other similar projects, how long did they take? And so it's not just extrapolating from your own limited experience, but looking at how long other projects took. It's really important. So are the original objectives attainable? Are the technology choices appropriate? Very crucial one here as well, because often people assume things that they shouldn't do around technology. And particularly if you're a manager developing a new content strategy, and you are told about a CCMS, a component content management system, and you hear that it's got a database. There are lots of assumptions made about these kind of things to say that, well, automatically you're going to be able to query all your content and do database-based publishing and this kind of stuff. Or alternately, that because it's got a database, you might be able to house all your product data in there as well. Literally the numeric data, non-content data, and this kind of thing. And I've seen people make these assumptions and mistakes, and it can be quite some way along the planning stage of the project before they're caught and addressed, and so quite an impact on the project as a whole. So you need to make sure that the proposed technology can actually do what it's needed to do. And one of the ways you can do that is by actually trying it out in practice, by prototyping it, by listing down the requirements, and then testing out some of the tools hands-on, and just seeing how they perform the different requirements, and then discussing with the vendors where you think they could do things differently or where you don't quite understand how it works. And this is a process we often facilitate at Mecon, and we call it a conference room prototype, and it's been very, very effective for helping people explore their assumptions and really pick a suitable product in the end. And then finally, do you have to have such a complex project in the first place? Maybe you're just being too ambitious. Can you prototype a new approach just based on the old tools, perhaps? And we've certainly worked with clients in the past. One particular one that comes to mind, they were in an organization which already owned a component-based CMS, a big one, and the teams that were using that CMS were doing good stuff with it and really saving money, doing complex translations and so on. And yet this team had this other team, they were doing kind of service documentation, and they were assuming that they could use the same system and that it would work well for them. And so they had had some talks with the teams that were leading the CMS project, and found that actually it had some limitations the way it was set up. They couldn't do tables the way they wanted to, and it was going to be more complex and expensive to change than they thought. And so they really started to question whether that was the right approach. And so we helped them look through their requirements, and it turned out they weren't really doing that much reuse at all. Very little reuse across their various documents that they were producing. And it was quite a simple workflow, and there was no translation. So there was very little case for training them all up. And in fact, at that point, they didn't have the authoring team anymore. They had to build up an authoring team from scratch. So really, everything was pointing to using a much simpler tool that could just do exactly what they needed. And so in the end, actually, we helped them implement Madcap Flare, which was totally adequate for what they needed. We helped put processes in place for SME review, conversion, outputs onto their in their specific HTML formats and so on. And they were very happy with that, and were able to write all the content they needed in time. So often it's good to just simplify and see if you actually need any new tools, or if you do they need to be so complex? So then, you need to build your new plan, and it's critical to involve and motivate everybody. And really, as I've said, all the key stakeholders need to understand something about how the system is going to achieve its benefits. And the people in the project team itself need to understand a fair bit about the system and how it works. Not everybody needs to be an administrator, of course, but people need to have a good feeling for the basic assumptions around the architecture and so on. And we worked with a company who had DITA implemented on them, basically. And so they were using DITA, and they had been told exactly what to do in what cases for authoring, but they knew very, very little about how it actually worked. So nobody in the organization really understood it very much. And so although they'd been using DITA for 2 years, they engaged us to give them a basic DITA training. And we thought, is that really what you want? You know, you've been using it for a while, don't you want like a more advanced training course or some consulting? But actually it turned out they really needed that basic training just to get up to speed with the basic concepts of DITA, and it was hugely helpful to them. And once they had that, they weren't stuck anymore. They could think how they could actually improve their system, and how they could improve the delivery, and from that the customer experience and so on. So it's very helpful. And conversely, if people in the organization don't understand, particularly key stakeholders and upper management, if they don't really understand how the system works or how it's going to achieve its benefits, then that's a bit of a recipe for failure. And one example is a big government agency was doing some quite innovative things with tagged with geolocations. And when the users of this system were at those particular locations, then the relevant chunks of content would be surfaced for them to do their job. And this was a multi-vendor project, and it involved several quite big technical pilots, and this had been done over a couple of years. And there was one key person who was coordinating all of this and had all the technical knowledge. And it has to be said, upper management didn't really understand that much how the thing was going to work, and they started to lose interest after a while. And then that project leader got a better offer in a different organization, and he left the government agency because there was nobody else who understood remotely as much as he did, and he didn't have the project didn't have that support from upper management. The whole thing folded quite quickly and was just completely abandoned. And so if more knowledge sharing had been done, if more people in that project team had understood the real kind of technical nuts and bolts, or if upper management had been educated better, not just persuaded, but really educated as to how the system worked and what it would really do to benefit the agency, then perhaps that project wouldn't have failed when the leader left. So training, really important. And it helps you make good decisions, and in the process of you training, perhaps as a project leader, you're training other people, and it makes you realize your own gaps in your technical assumptions perhaps about how the tools are going to work. So it's a virtuous kind of a cycle. And you should also, there is, as I've said, there's this tendency to be very binary about things. A project is a success or a failure. If it's a failure, everything that went before is no good. This is not actually a healthy attitude. There is always something that you learn from doing any project, no matter how bad. And so even if the project so far has been going quite badly, people in the team will have been learning from it, getting some ideas of how to improve things the next time. So you really have to make the most of that learning and not just abandon, not, as we say in the UK, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Really try and make the most of that knowledge that you have in the team and nurture it, and don't just abandon the old stuff entirely. So build a new plan. Use an iterative approach. So I talked a little bit about this before in the connection with change management, but iterative approaches are so important. First of all, generally, so lean, agile, and other iterative approaches here are the three at the top, and you can see that they tend to be much more successful than the more traditional waterfall-based approaches, which don't allow you to learn after completing a project phase. Don't allow you to learn and change quite so much. But iterative approaches are all about taking a concrete step forward, having something to show for it, and being able to change your direction at the end of that. So it's a crucial thing for project success. And it also allows you to shape the schedule itself. And sometimes projects do take a bit longer than you think. It takes more planning than you think you're going to need. But if you've broken it into kind of bite-sized chunks, then you're more able to deal with that successfully rather than having to change a multi-year schedule. I think once you've got your project plan, I really like this idea. It was developed by a guy called Gary Klein, another researcher, really a contemporary of Daniel Kahneman. And whereas Daniel Kahneman looks a lot at cognitive biases and the ways that our brains can trick themselves, Gary Klein is much more about how we can use our intuition and experience to make sensible decisions. And so he was concerned about this kind of groupthink aspect of projects that I talked about before, because when you start a new project, you're always very optimistic. Nobody wants to rock the boat, and so it's kind of discouraged to really identify risks. It's not popular. And so Klein started this approach to really to creatively encourage people to come up with possible risks and strengthen the project plan. And so what you do once you've got your project plan, but before you actually commence the project, or before you commence the rescue of the project, as in this case that I'm talking about, you get the project team together. There is an activity organizer, and he or she explains that you have to imagine that the project has failed, and you have to list down all the reasons that the project has failed, and you do this individually. And then starting from the project manager, then everybody lists one reason, and the activity leader writes this up on a whiteboard, and you go around the room exhausting all the reasons until there aren't any more different reasons why the project might fail. And it almost has this kind of competitive edge to it to see who can get the most or the best reasons why the project might fail. So it's really trying to reverse that groupthink team psychology thing about being averse to bringing up risks. So you've got this big list of risks then, and then you can go through them systematically and see which ones are real concerns and how you can address them and how you can strengthen your project plan or your project rescue plan, as in this case. So consider a pre-mortem. and then execute the plan in steps, remembering to learn and adapt as you go along. It's really crucial. Know what direction you're going towards. Establish success metrics. And there's not so much saying how will we know when we're done, because these kind of projects are never completely done. There are always improvements to make, but at least how will we know when it's working? So establish objective criteria to know when you've got to that state. And you should stay alert to further early warning signs as you go along, of course. And that applies not only when you're in the kind of implementation stage, but also once the project is stable for a while. It might well be that things are not running quite as efficiently as they could be, and you should be alert to the signs of that, and to giving the whole system a bit of a tune-up in that case. And this is something that we've actually done recently. So a big medical device company was using a CCMS system. They had quite a complex implementation. It was working relatively efficiently, but it was really tough for the authors because they were expected to fill in a lot of kind of code, really, attribute values and things that they had to remember and copy and paste into the content over and above just writing the content. It was quite fiddly. Things often went wrong. It was quite error prone. And so I went in there and talked with the team, great team. They understood their problems, but we really helped explore from an external kind of point of view, what could we do to simplify the authoring experience and still get the kind of quality of the results that they had. And so we came up with a number of different approaches, including specializing the data, changing the templates, and constraining the authoring environment itself to make things much easier. And so we're on a path to making the authoring experience much more efficient and confidence inspiring for this company. So it's something you can do at any stage. You don't have to wait until things are really bad. At any point, it's worth looking at where things are not quite efficient and giving them a general kind of a tune-up. So I would say overall the theme of this presentation is really about change management. It's about managing change for people. Because a move to something like structured content is just such a huge change in the way you work. If you've been used to, say, desktop publishing, a desktop publishing type of model, Word, unstructured frames, something like that, InDesign or whatever, typically a writer is going to have their own book, it belongs to them, and then they're the one that releases it and so on. But if you're using a centralized content management system, it's completely different. Everybody has visibility to everything. You're often not responsible for the whole book yourself. You're just writing a part of it, and others are contributing to that. It becomes much more of a kind of a collective experience. In some ways, people feel they lose creativity. In other ways, I think they gain it because they have to spend less time on kind of helping the system along, and they can concentrate on the words themselves, as this should really. But it's still a massive change to get used to. And so we often talk about migrating to structured content or migrating to a new content management system. And I'm not sure that migrating is the right word. Migration is what birds do, right? And when a bird migrates from Northern Europe to sub-Saharan Africa, when it gets there, it's basically the same bird, isn't it? Apart from it might be missing a feather or two. But I think the changes we go through in moving to a new content management paradigm are much bigger than that, and it's more like a frog, a tadpole changing into a frog. So much more of a metamorphosis than just a migration. So it's all about change management and doing that well. What's the crucial factor to that? So one more study, and this time from IBM, and it was about change management in IT projects and what makes them successful. First of all, that big one, upper management sponsorship, of course. So we come back to education and really establishing the benefits of the project. But then the others are all about the people in the team, the people in the organization, about involvement, communication, motivation, and so on. So it's a really critical factor there. It's not so much about the technology itself, it's about the way that people work with it. And this was a really nice quote from that report. I'll just let you read for a minute. So it's so that change happens through people and not just to them. I really like that. So I hope you can take away something from this presentation. Here's perhaps a few things to focus on. So you certainly need to be monitoring things at all times. So if you're just setting up a project, look for early warning signs of risk if you can. It's not always easy, but try to do so. If you're identifying risks, then, I think have some courage in pointing them out. And if you do so in the right kind of way, and if you're in a supportive organization, then, hopefully you'll be respected for that. That's certainly what I've found. And then once you're actually turning things around, make sure you're tracking success metrics so you know when you've really made progress. This middle one is really the crucial one. Inform people and involve them. Inform upper management of what's going on. Tell them about the successes. Tell them about the challenges too, because they're going to find out sooner or later. But above all, just keep them informed and educated on how the project's going. Educate the project team as well. Make sure you don't just have one leader that knows everything and the others are just following them. That's a recipe for disaster. Look for those bright spots, pockets of knowledge already. Don't just, for example, get a consulting agency to do everything for you. That kind of approach never works. You have to be learning, you have to be making the most of your own strengths and so on. So certainly in the work that we do as Mekon with organizations, we're always looking to do it as a partnership, rather than being the kind of the gurus that come down from on high and dictate how things should be done, because that just doesn't work. And then iterate, of course. So crucial if you can do this. Know where you're going, but tackle one phase at a time and give yourself space after completing a project phase to reflect on it and see if you need to change the direction at all. And based on that, also manage people's expectations. And I think that becomes easier if you're just doing a chunk at a time to explain this is why we need to do this in this systematic kind of a way. And we're not going to realize the whole benefits of the whole project instantly, but you'll be able to see progress as it goes along. And I think that's quite confidence inspiring. Okay, thanks very much for listening to my talk. We've got time for some questions now, and then if you have any other questions later, feel free to get in touch with me on Twitter here or at Mekon. Oh, and yeah, I was going to mention about the cows. Do they really sit down just before it rains? And the jury's out on that. They sit down more when it's cold, and possibly that could be an indicator of rain, but possibly not. So that's that one. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Joe. A very informative webinar indeed. We have several questions that have been submitted. The first being, how do you set up a project well from the start so that you avoid the problems in the first place?
Yeah. No, that's a good question, and it's an ideal position to be in, really, isn't it? And so I think it's very much drawing on these aspects of project rescue that I've talked about. And so it is firstly gathering requirements really well. I've said people often have this kind of a wish list that's not grounded in what the tools can really do. And so really be thoughtful about your requirements. And here's where I think above anything else, here's where you could do with some external help from people who are experienced in this particular field and can tell you what's realistic, what's possible that you might not even know about, and what's just kind of fantasy, if you like. So gather good requirements, do prototyping, test the tools out hands-on, do little proofs of concepts, technical proofs of concept as well, where you need to test certain bits of integration or something. Do stress testing if you're doing something particularly ambitious technically as well. Quite often you might see something working well on a developer's desktop, and then if it's rolled out at scale, sometimes the performance isn't that great, so do some stress testing, and then do some pilots. And as that blog post of yours said, really make sure they're small and effective pilots and don't try and do a huge thing all at one time. So basically iterating and making sure to educate everybody that's involved in a way that's appropriate to them. You're not going to give, the CEO a 2-hour training session on DIT or something like that, but at least it's good if key upper management figures understand a little bit about the assumptions of the thing, how it works, and the planning you need to do, and so on. So yeah, I think the same kind of approaches really can help if you're starting a project from scratch.
Great, thank you, Joe. The next question that's come in is, what's the place of minimalism and better writing and avoiding project risks?
Okay. No, it's a good question, and I think it's got a big place, actually, I would say. So minimalism in general, and this is a term particularly from technical communication, and it refers to not, as it sounds, just kind of writing less stuff, but writing focused stuff that does its job, focused content that really does its job. And so this is, I think it is helpful. It might not sound as if it's helpful to the technical side, but I think really knowing what your content is supposed to do and who it's for and how it looks helps you simplify things to the extent. I often see people building up these big kind of complex systems, and particularly on things like PDF generation and things like that, feeling they have to have these big and complex PDFs just like they always used to do. And the users might not actually need all that complexity, and it's kind of slowing things down, making it more expensive, making it harder to actually get content out to users and so on. So I think focusing on what exactly users need can help slim down the whole project and make it more effective and focused.
Great, thank you, Joe. The next question that has come in is, how do you deal with project issues when the projects are across different continents?
Okay. Yeah, interesting one, and it's certainly one that I've done a number of times in the past. Well, typically speaking, if it's across Europe, then we're not talking about a huge culture gap or time zone gap or whatever. But obviously, if you're working with organizations in Asia and so on, then there might be things that you don't quite expect and so on. And it's, I think what I would say there is that you have to spend more time on really understanding people, understanding where they're coming from, the way that they communicate, what their assumptions are, and don't just assume that people are on the same wavelength as you and that you're, whatever you say is going in, because people have their own takes on things and they're not always going to volunteer the information that you want. So I think you have to really be patient, take time, and work harder when you've got a multi-kind of continental project to deal with. So it's very much about effective communication skills, but above all it's listening, I would say.
Great, thank you, Joe, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. This will conclude today's broadcast. You'll be able to access the recorded version of this webinar in the webinar archive section of our website located at www.dclab.com. Our next webinar will be Tuesday, July 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Translation Management, Common Sense for Setting Up a Process, presented by Scott Carsters, Senior Global Executive, Kinetic Technology Agency. Thank you everyone for attending and have a great day.